Hi students, this is the video for lesson 4.13 and we'll be going over the water and nitrogen cycles. So again, we'll be going over how both nitrogen and water cycle through living things, the earth, and through the atmosphere. So before we go over the specifics of the nitrogen and water cycle, it's important to know why abiotic materials like nitrogen and water need to be recycled. So many of you guys have probably drank water from various sources, whether it be a water bottle, water from a river, or maybe just water from your kitchen tap. All of that water is used water. And what I mean by that is that those water molecules were probably once part of a stream, a cloud, a plant, or maybe even part of your own body. They've all been part of something else. They've been used and recycled just like the air molecules that you're breathing. Without the natural recycling of abiotic materials such as water, carbon, oxygen, etc., life on Earth could not be. We reuse everything and we recycle everything, which means that everything has been used before and it will be used again. So here is a picture of the water cycle. So water can be found in various places. One, water can be found in the atmosphere. And when it's in the atmosphere, it exists mainly as water vapor. When it's on Earth, it exists mainly as either water or as glaciers and iceberg, which are forms of solid. Okay, so water in the ocean would be liquid, and the ones in glaciers and icebergs would be solid. The water on Earth, though, doesn't just stay on Earth. It'll eventually go up into the atmosphere through a process called evaporation. And there are two ways that water can be made available for evaporation. One would be respiration, which would be like when we exhale water molecules, and another would be transpiration, which is when we have plants expelling water onto their surfaces. Eventually, those water molecules that are available will go up into the atmosphere. Once water moves into the atmosphere through evaporation, it'll then eventually condense, and that's how we have clouds. And that's a process called condensation. Once we have clouds, then eventually the water will return back to Earth through precipitation. And we'll go over different forms of precipitation in just a bit. So respiration and transpiration, both of these are ways that living things give off water. Okay, so respiration, an example of this would be the breath of different animals exhaled into the atmosphere, and that's in the form of water vapor. So again, that's the breath of different animals when they exhale in the form of water vapor going into the atmosphere. Another example of this would be transpiration, which is essentially the same thing, except it's with plants expelling water onto the surface of their leaves. Okay, so we see here animals expelling water vapor when they exhale, and also moisture on this leaf through transpiration. Once we have those water molecules made available through respiration and transpiration, we can get those water molecules back into the atmosphere through evaporation. And how evaporation works is that the sun warms the earth, and when the sun warms the earth, it causes the water to warm up, eventually turning into water vapor, and that causes the water droplets to go into the atmosphere as water vapor. Once it goes into the atmosphere, it's colder, and that causes the water to then become liquid and then condense. Condensation is when we store water in the form of clouds. If we were to look more closely, we would see that these water particles or molecules come together in condensation and are stored in the form of clouds. Once we have the water molecules in the form of clouds, the water will eventually move from the atmosphere to Earth in the form of precipitation. Some examples of precipitation would be snow, rain, and hail, and it really just depends on the temperature that the water is precipitating that determines what type of precipitation would occur. If it's colder, then it would be snow, but if it wasn't as cold, then it would be something like rain.
Where does water come from? Rain? Snow? The sea? But where does rain and snow come from? There is a constant amount of water on the Earth, and it can be in the form of a solid, liquid, or gas. The water cycle describes how water moves and changes from one form to another. It's made up of 4 steps. First, evaporation. When the sun heats up water in rivers or lakes or the sea, it becomes vapour. The water vapour rises and goes into the air. Water vapour is also created by plants through what's called transpiration, water given off from plant leaves, which then evaporates into the air. Water vapour in the air gets cold and changes back into liquid, forming clouds. This is called condensation. The same thing happens when warm water is poured into a container and ice is introduced. Water vapour coming into contact with the ice is cooled and condenses, forming clouds. When so much water has condensed that the air or the clouds cannot hold any more, then we get precipitation. Water falls back to the Earth in the form of rain, hail, sleet, or snow. The final part of the cycle is collection. Some of the water will fill up rivers and lakes, and some of it will soak into the earth and become part of the groundwater system. Then the cycle starts all over again.
Now let's go over the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is mostly found in the atmosphere, but it'll cycle between various reservoirs. So nitrogen, along with oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen, make up 96% of the living matter in your body. But out of all of those, nitrogen gas is really important. It actually makes up 78% of the Earth's atmosphere. However, nitrogen in the Earth's atmosphere is found as nitrogen gas. And this nitrogen gas, even though it makes up 78% of the Earth's atmosphere, it's not in the form that is used by living things. So we need to convert this nitrogen gas into a usable form. Okay, so that's really important for you to know. This nitrogen gas, which is found in the atmosphere, must be converted into some sort of usable form. And so we're going to be talking about how we can get the atmospheric nitrogen gas into the usable form in the later slides. Okay, so here's a picture of the nitrogen cycle. Before we get into the nitrogen cycle, just want to remind you guys of why nitrogen is so important. Remember, nitrogen is needed to make proteins and to make DNA. Both are extremely important in order to keep your individual cells alive, which means it's important to keep every organism alive as well. So it's really important that we have a constant supply of nitrogen so that it's recycled throughout the atmosphere, Earth, and living things. So the atmosphere is where most of the nitrogen is found on Earth. Remember, with water, we found that the largest reservoir for water was the oceans, but for nitrogen, it's actually found in the atmosphere in the form of nitrogen gas. Okay, so there are a couple ways that nitrogen can get back into the atmosphere. One is by fertilizer production and the burning of fossil fuels that releases nitrogen into both the soil and also into the atmosphere. Okay, so we have lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere. That nitrogen gas can go into the soil as well. Once it's in the soil, remember we can't use the nitrogen gas for living things, so we have something called nitrogen fixing bacteria, and their job is to convert that gas into compounds that plants and animals can actually use. And so once we change or convert that nitrogen gas into a form that we can actually use, that means that the plants will be able to have nitrogen in it. Then animals can eat those plants, so they would get nitrogen, and then animals can eat those animals, and they can get their nitrogen that way. So we see that progressively the nitrogen will move up the food chain. But when these animals die, we want to recycle those nitrogen molecules back into the atmosphere. And the way that we do that is by using denitrifying bacteria. And they convert the usable nitrogen that the animals were using, and they convert it back into gas. Once it's back into gas, then it can return back into the atmosphere. Another way that nitrogen is recycled is through runoff. And runoff is basically when we have water on land that carry nitrogen from the ground or the soil into the ocean. So here's a video on the nitrogen cycle.
Nitrogen is an essential element for plants and animals. It's needed to make protein and DNA. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas, but nitrogen is very unreactive and can't be used directly by plants or animals. It needs to be converted into nitrates before most plants can use it. Nitrates in the soil are absorbed by the roots of plants, which then build them up into complex proteins. These tomato plants have been grown in different concentrations of nitrate solution for the same amount of time, but they look quite different. With enough nitrate, the plant is healthy. It's grown tall and bushy. As the nitrate concentration decreases, so too does the health of the plant. So where does the nitrate present in the soil come from? Lightning provides a small amount. It converts nitrogen gas present in the atmosphere directly into nitrates. A more reliable way of increasing the nitrate content of soil is to add fertilizer. Inorganic fertilizer contains nitrates which can be absorbed by plants straight away. Organic fertilizer, like manure, contains dead animal and plant material. As it decays, it releases nitrogen compounds into the soil. A range of bacteria break down the proteins in manure and convert them to ammonium compounds. Ammonium ions contain nitrogen and hydrogen, but for most plants to be able to build up proteins, these need to be converted to nitrates. This is carried out by nitrifying bacteria. Another process involves nitrogen-fixing bacteria. These take up atmospheric nitrogen. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria exist free in the soil or in the roots of certain plants, like clover. Special nitrogen-fixing bacteria, called rhizobium, live in tiny nodules on the roots. The bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium ions and eventually proteins. To show the existence of these bacteria, the outer surface of the nodules must first be sterilised, so that only the rhizobium bacteria inside the nodule are alive. After washing in bleach and rinsing with water, a glass rod is used to crush the nodules and liberate the bacteria inside. A loop of wire is heated in a flame to make it completely sterile. It's then dipped into the bacteria and transferred to a sterile plate containing agar. After a few days' incubation, the rhizobium has multiplied and is now visible.
Nitrogen-fixing bacteria are really important because they convert nitrogen gas, which we find in the atmosphere, into ammonia and nitrates, which are usable forms of nitrogen. So one example of how this is done is that in certain root nodules of plants, we have bacteria that actually convert the nitrogen gas into these ammonia nitrates. And when they do this, now plants can take up that nitrogen, and then other organisms can eat the plants, and the nitrogen substance can move up the food chain. So again, remember, atmospheric nitrogen gas cannot be used, so we rely on these nitrogen-fixing bacteria in root nodules of plants to convert it into ammonia and nitrates so that the plants can take up the nitrogen, and eventually other organisms in the food chain can as well. We also have bacteria that help with the opposite process, where we convert nitrates into nitrogen gas. And the reason why we would want to do that is so that the nitrogen that is found in the nitrates can return back into the atmosphere. Okay, because remember, we're trying to recycle all of these abiotic materials. And this process is called denitrification. So again, these bacteria, what they're doing is they're converting the nitrates and ammonia back into nitrogen gas so that it can go into the atmosphere. So runoff is a concept that affects both the water cycle as well as the nitrogen cycle. So runoff from the water cycle is when we have water that is not soaked into the soil or into the rocks that eventually run off the land and go into some sort of water source. And so when we had colonial Americans cutting down forests in order to make farms, what they were doing was actually depleting the soil of nutrients that it needed. And the reason why this happened is because the trees in a forest act as a barrier and prevent the water from carrying too many nutrients off of the land and into water sources. And so what they did, even though they didn't realize it, was deplete the soil of all of its nutrients. So here's a summary of what we went over today. We went over the nitrogen cycle and how it cycled through living things, the earth, and the atmosphere. And for the nitrogen cycle, we talked about two different types of bacteria that help us with this cycle. We talked about nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and we also talked about denitrifying bacteria as well. Remember, those two are important because they help cycle through the nitrogen from atmospheric nitrogen gas to ammonia nitrates and then back into the atmospheric nitrogen gas. We also went over the water cycle, where we went over respiration, transpiration, evaporation, condensation, and then precipitation. So again, remember, these recycling of the abiotic materials are really important because there's a constant supply of the nitrogen and water that's available, so it's important that they are used and reused again. So here's some important vocabulary that you need to know. Respiration is when an organism exchanges gases with its environment. Transpiration is when the plant loses water to the atmosphere, the surface of its leaves, and we saw a picture of this. It looks like dew. We have evaporation, which is when water changes to water vapor and it goes into the atmosphere. We have condensation, which is when water vapor changes from gas to liquid, and this is when we form clouds. And lastly, we have denitrification, which is when we convert nitrates back into the gaseous nitrogen, or in other words, nitrogen gas, and the nitrogen gas will then be able to re-enter the atmosphere.